Hey everyone, my name is Charlie Ifra and welcome to my podcast. Today I'm going to tell you a story that happened on Twitter about a week and a half ago, and it's a story about two Twitter users that made a bet. One of the users is a very well-known character by the name of Balaji Srinivasan. Now, Balaji placed a bet that the price of Bitcoin is going to hit $1 million US per Bitcoin, and he went on to say that this is going to happen in the next 90 days. So to give you a little bit of background of who Balaji is, Balaji is very, very well known for his predictions. He actually made almost 100% accurate predictions when it came to the pandemic. He made these predictions years before the pandemic happened. He made predictions about how the governments would react to the pandemic. He made predictions around the economic outcomes of the pandemic. And he's also a very well-known entrepreneur. Balaji was the CTO of Coinbase, which is one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in the world. Balaji was also a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, which is a VC firm, a very well-known VC firm in Silicon Valley. Balaji also sold at least two of his companies with 9-digit exits. So he's a very successful entrepreneur. He's also a mathematician. He's a philosopher. He's very, very big in the podcast circuit. He recently did a 7-hour conversation with Lex Fridman. He's done several interviews with Tim Ferriss, and I highly recommend going ahead and doing some research on him and listening to some of his content. He authored a book called The Network State. It's a short book. It's available for free. It's a really interesting concept about the future of how communities and organizations or humans can organize. And it's based on self-sovereignty and just in the post-internet age and how states can be formed by not necessarily being geographic, but really being digital. Very, very interesting concepts, and I highly recommend everyone finding some time and researching it. He thinks very much in the future, and I think with this thinking, he makes a lot of predictions, and I personally believe that a lot of what his predictions, what he's predicting are going to actually happen. Now, before I continue, I just want to say that while I do believe that the price of Bitcoin will go potentially up to $1 million, I don't think it's going to happen within the next 90 days. And I also very, very want to clearly state that this is not financial advice. My beliefs don't mean that it's going to happen. But I'm telling you what Balaji's prediction. I'm also telling you why he made this prediction, and I'd like you to think about it, analyze it for yourself, and think about what it might mean in the context of your finances. So let's get into the story, or why Balaji believes that the price of Bitcoin is going to go to $1 million. So this really, the conversation and then eventually the bet happened because of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse that happened a few weeks ago. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. And we'll also talk about other banks and how all these banks encountering similar issues to SVB is going to potentially make the price of Bitcoin $1 million. And so during the pandemic, there was a lot of pain people were feeling. People were out of jobs. Companies were in a lot of trouble and needed a lot of help and support and bailouts. And so the Fed and the politicians pumped trillions of dollars into the economy. Corporations like the airlines and other industries needed to stay afloat, and the government just pumped as much money as they can into them in order to make sure that they can keep making payroll. We also saw individuals who were out of work getting those $1,200 checks. And Another thing the Fed did to, take away as much pain as possible is they dropped interest rates to 0%. Now, with all this money being injected into the economy, and all this money going to corporations and individuals, the money had to be placed somewhere. So people got their checks, and the natural thing to do is to put them in the bank. And so the bank all of a sudden got this huge injection of cash from depositors. And then in turn, what the banks have to do is take that the depositors' money, and invest it. And that's what banks do with depositors' money. Now, the problem is that, and this is where SVB ran into Silicon Valley Bank, ran into their problems, is that usually when banks invest depositors' money, what they'll do is they invest it in both short and long-term investments. And the problem is that the short-term investments weren't really available to the banks because the interest rate was at 0%. So the only place that they could have conservatively invested the money is in long-term investments. And in this case, it was 10-year bonds at 1.5%. Now, it's a conservative and safe investment. The problem happens when there's a bank run. So let me just explain what happens when there is a bank run. So if a user, let's say an individual, for example, if I buy a stock at $100 and the stock price drops to $80, and I go to the bank and I want to borrow money against my holdings, my stock holdings. So I can go to the bank and ask them to borrow money. They're only going to lend me against the value of my stock portfolio today, not my stock portfolio when I purchased it. So my $100 is no longer $100, it's $80. So I can only borrow against the $80. Now, with banks, the regulators treat them a little bit different. The regulators, they allow the banks, when they do their filings, to describe their assets and the value of their assets at what they call the hold to maturity value, which is a little bit of a tricky thing. They're kind of gaming the system because, yes, the investment will be worth, that initial investment plus 1.5% in 10 years from now. But because interest rates dropped to 0%, what happened was they devalued the investment that those banks made. So those long-term bonds were worth less than the investment that they made at the time that the depositors wanted to take their money out. And so there was a little footnote in one of the SEC filings of Silicon Valley Bank. And this person who found that footnote noticed that there was $80 billion invested in long-term bonds that were devalued. And when they published that information, there was a bank run that happened at Silicon Valley Bank, and the depositors rushed to take their money out. $42 billion were withdrawn. There wasn't enough to satisfy the rest of the depositors, and the bank collapsed. Now, this happened right before a weekend. So people started panicking. The bankers were panicking. The public was panicking. The Fed was panicking because what they were fearing was that many other banks, especially the smaller and regional banks, are in the same situation as SVB. And the situation, just to recap, is that they don't have enough liquid to be able to satisfy the depositors. As a matter of fact, their assets are not valued as much as the depositor initially deposited. And so over the weekend, the Fed and the bankers, the regulators, the politicians, they all got together. And what they landed on is that the US government committed to protecting all the depositors in full. And the reason they did this is because they didn't want a bank run to happen on all the other banks on Monday morning. Now, this is very different than what the regular FDIC insures on individual bank accounts. So just to give you a little background, in the US, when someone has a bank account, that bank account is insured for up to $250,000. So what a lot of people do, if you have $500,000, one of the ways to protect yourself is to open two bank accounts and put 250,000 in each account. Now, as your deposits and account value get higher and higher, it becomes much harder to open more and more accounts. So what people will do is they even diversify across banks. So if a smaller bank goes under, then they have a nice percentage of their portfolio or their cash sitting with one of the larger banks. And so basically, what the regulators have decided to do is, even though there is a hard limit of insuring up to $250,000, they just said in order to prevent a bank run from happening, they're going to protect any amount that was sitting in the bank. And that's really important for Silicon Valley Bank because many startups, tech companies, have their money there. And some of these companies have millions and millions of dollars sitting there. And those companies are kind of the backbone of the US economy when it comes to tech. And having those companies lose all their money would put them all out of business. And that would greatly affect the US tech industry. But because they did it for Silicon Valley Bank, the government also said that any other bank that's in the same situation, the depositors will be protected should there be a bank run. Interestingly enough, a report came out from the Kansas Fed, if I'm not mistaken. The Kansas Fed office released a report, and Balaji actually tweeted it. And this report published that there were 333 community banks in the United States that are in the exact same position as Silicon Valley Bank. And so this protection will avoid a bank run on all of these banks, giving the banks an opportunity to figure out how they can adjust and recover. So just to recap, let's talk about why Balaji, now that you have this background, let me recap why Balaji made this bet and what his thinking is behind it. So number one, the banks have been insolvent, and the Fed, the FDIC, and the banks themselves. So the Fed is the central bank, the FDIC are the regulators, and the banks themselves, both the large and the small banks, have known this for over a year. So they've been insolvent. They've known about it for over a year. They unfortunately didn't make it public. They didn't talk about it. The people that are in the know were in the know, but it's very few in the public that know about this. Number two, they knew this very clearly because the Fed hiked rates. And after telling the banks that they won't hike rates, the banks went in and bought those long-term bonds. And then very soon after, in 2022, they hiked rates and they devalued all the bonds that they sold to the bank in the previous year. And number three, when the government steps in to protect depositors, the way they do it is they need to print trillions of dollars. And that's the only way that they're going to protect depositors is by printing more money. Now, while they believe it's necessary to do so to save the economy, the fact of the matter is that when you print trillions of dollars, it creates enormous inflationary pressure. And Balaji believes that when enough people understand this, and when enough people understand that the banking system is on the brink of collapse, when the public understands that printing trillions and trillions of dollars, like we saw during the pandemic, and like what we see they're doing today, people are going to want to move their money into assets that have no counterparty risk. So when I say a counterparty risk, what it really means is that there's another party that you're relying on to handle your money, i.e. a bank. Bitcoin, not to get into the technology of it, but there is no counterparty risk with Bitcoin. There are market risks, which is why the Bitcoin price fluctuates, but there is no counterparty risk. So that's the story. Like I said, this isn't financial advice. It's just a story, and it's something to think about. So let me know what your thoughts are. Please like and subscribe. and I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.